And in this one here, you've got Brandon Lewis taking on Daniel Marcos, and it's such a weird fight. Daniel Marcos hasn't fought for about 2.5 years, and he's on the contender series, and even then, like, he was fighting a guy that was 10-5. He does have wins over guys with really, really good records, but when I was watching them, they didn't really look as good as the record suggested. Like, Daniel Marcos was fighting Gaston Manzo, who was listed at 5'5" on Tapology, but Daniel Marcos looked so much bigger than his opponent in that fight, and then he's fighting guys that are 5-4, and then 8-2, which is good, 7-1, which is good, and then 5-3. This is like 5 years ago we're talking about. Daniel Marcos hasn't been super active, and then even then, he hasn't fought for almost like 2.5 years now. And now he's on the contender series against Brandon Lewis, who is returning from his previous unsuccessful contender series bout against Mo Miller. And he did kind of bounce back there, and he fought Taylor Moore, which is locked behind like a paywall to watch that fight, which was painful. But we got there. I found it eventually. But once again, Brandon Lewis hasn't been that active either. He took a decent hiatus between his two LFA fights. I'm not too sure why. Maybe he was studying or kind of doing something, focusing on a career elsewhere potentially. And then he come back, looked alright. He beat a guy by split decision. Then he took on Mo Miller, a super prospect at the time. In hindsight, maybe Mo Miller wasn't as good as we all thought he was. And what does give me a little bit of reservations in this fight is, in that fight, Mo Miller, the wrestler, was hitting Brandon Lewis with some big shots, and he was landing them quite easily, which is kind of interesting when you come to this prediction, because Daniel Marcos is a kickboxer. That is really what he brings to the game. He throws a lot of front kicks. He does have pretty good boxing as well, and does throw combinations if it allows it. He does have a good clinch game himself, but his takedown defense is also good. But it's definitely worth noting the guys that have tried to take him down are not to the level of Brandon Lewis. Brandon Lewis, I would say, he shows a lot of striking in his fights. He definitely, when he was fighting Mo Miller, wanted the fight to be on the feet. But he did get taken down 4 times in that matchup, which is somewhat of a concern. But Daniel Marcos ain't gonna try and take him down. So, Lewis, once again, the smaller man in the matchup. I believe Mo Miller was 5'8" in that Dynamite's Contender Series fight. And Daniel Marcos, in all of his fights, really, he's been the bigger man. So it's not going to be anything new to him. But I can sit here and give you a breakdown on what Daniel Marcos has looked like in the past. And Daniel Marcos could walk into that octagon a completely different fighter, because he's taken 2.5 years off. He's 29 years old, so he will be... Sorry, I was turning my heater off. He will still be making improvements in his career, and he could just completely look different. He could come out there and wrestle and grapple Brandon Lewis and just shock everyone. But, yeah, as I said, he hasn't fought in 2.5 years. It's so hard to make a prediction. I have been wanting to pick Daniel Marcos in this fight here. It's definitely worth noting, though, if you want to find footage on this guy, search Daniel Soncora instead. You'll find a lot more. But I'm gonna side with Brandon Lewis. It's a risky one because he is quite hittable on the feet. At least he was in the Mo Miller fight. But he's got underrated wrestling and grappling, and if he really, really wants to win this fight, I think that's what he's got to look to do, because Daniel Marcos is showing great takedown defense, but not against the greatest level of competition at all. I mean, in fact, I'd say that Brandon Lewis almost tends to be like just seems like the better fighter, the much better fighter. If you watch the tape and you look at Daniel Marcos 12-0 against good competition, you would expect to be super impressed. But I just wasn't really. It was such a weird situation. It's a very winnable fight for both guys. It could go either way. It really could. I mean, Marcos hasn't fought since 2019, so I don't really know how he's gonna look. He's got a great record, he really does, but it's just so tough to pick him when he hasn't fought since 2019, and even then in the tape study I haven't been overly impressed, whereas Brandon Lewis is 25 years old, he's making constant improvements. He unfortunately did miss weight, it seems like, in his last fight, unless there was a catch weight and I completely missed it. But I shouldn't be sorting this out on video, but we're 4 minutes into the prediction already. Oh dear. But yeah, it's just a weird one. Yeah, it looks like he might have missed weight in that fight. But yeah, anyways, pick is Brandon Lewis. Not that confident. Not many people going with Lewis, probably because they look at his record and are making their prediction. But I'm gonna have to go with Brandon Lewis. In hindsight, the loss to Mo Miller isn't that great, and even if he does win and get a contract, it's gonna be a pretty tough road ahead, because I think that both guys haven't proven to me that they're going to be able to do great things in the UFC, and I know that's a very harsh thing for me to say, just a guy that is sitting behind a camera, but this is such a hard fight to predict, and both guys haven't looked absolutely incredible on tape, so I'm going to go with Brandon Lewis. I think he's a little bit better. Daniel Marcos, I was watching his fights, and I just wasn't impressed. He was beating up guys that were so much smaller than him, in arenas that were selling like hundreds of tickets too. Like, not really arenas, they just look like gyms, but heaps of people were showing up to the fights, but that's not the point. Let's just move on to the next fight.